General Jodl, Chief of Staff of the German Army, faced his conquerors across a narrow table in a French schoolroom, and thus ended the reign of the so-called master race. Official emissary of the defeated Nazi Empire, Jodl surrendered unconditionally to the victorious Allied powers, with the United States represented by Lieutenant General Walter Beadle Smith. In just a few minutes, the simple ceremony in the little schoolroom brought to an end the major phase of the most paralyzing war the world had ever known. A war which had involved millions of men, some of whom fought relentlessly for the domination of the world, and others to give mankind throughout the world the chance to live in freedom and at peace. The long-awaited victory was a reality. In its wake, the war left Germany in ruins, her principal cities and towns demolished, some 8 million of her people killed or wounded, and her industry almost obliterated. A nation completely broken in spirit and starving. For the Allies, the price of victory was appallingly high, beyond the powers of any statistician to compute.
Wehrmacht was invincible. Many of the captured Nazi soldiers seemed sadly disillusioned. Their dream of world conquest that had grown to enormous proportions since September 1939 was suddenly over. Stripped of the mantle of conqueror, the Nazi soldier was ill-prepared psychologically for the role of the vanquished. These were the supermen, the elite of the master race. Their path of victory, begun so triumphantly in Berlin nearly 4 years earlier, had come to a sorry end in Tunis. Beaten and bedraggled, they wore the face of every people who have tried to conquer the world and impose their will on others. The Nazi world conquerors ended up like all the rest. Caught in the giant Allied squeeze, the Nazis were wiped right off the African continent. The victory was officially ours on May 13th, 1943, and the once feared Afrika Corps no longer existed.
Adolf Hitler once had a great army which is called the Afrika Corps. It was commanded by General Erwin Rommel, who came to be known as the Desert Fox. Today, the brood of the fox has been utterly destroyed. Every member of that army, as well as every member of von Armand's army that Hitler sent into Africa to support Rommel, is either dead or has been captured. This great victory stands as a monument to the perfection of cooperation among the fighting services of the Allied nations in this field. You would be proud of the way the British and French have fought here so magnificently. I know you would be proud of the way our own boys, your husbands, brothers, sons, and sweethearts, have delivered here for you.
Although busily engaged in preparations for an invasion across the Mediterranean, the Allies took time off to hold a victory parade in Tunis on May 20th, marking the end of the Axis Empire in Africa. Won in Africa, General Eisenhower departed for Malta several weeks later to begin intensive planning for the operation which would constitute our first blow against the Nazis on European soil. At Casablanca in January 1943, plans for our future conduct of the war against Hitler were developed.
Alternative missions for the Mediterranean forces were discussed by the combined chiefs of staff. One of these was to assault Sicily without delay. The other was to capture Sardinia and Corsica. The Casablanca Conference directed that the next campaign was to be the capture of Sicily. Sicily abuts both Africa and Italy so closely that it practically severs the Mediterranean, and its capture would greatly reduce the hazards of using that sea route.
With Sicily ours, the next step would be clear: to attack the enemy on the European continent itself.
Development of the Sicilian plan, assigned the code name Husky, began in February.
North Africa became the platform from which the invasion of Europe was to be launched. Sustaining an offensive on European soil for an extended period constituted a major problem in supply. Equipment which would be needed months later had to be shipped to North Africa and prepared for use in the oncoming campaign.
We felt that some 5 or 6 divisions should be deployed in the initial landing. These forces were to attack Sicily in early July, and all preparation was based upon keeping of that target date. Study indicated the desirability of first seizing the island of Pantelleria, lying roughly between Sicily and the northeastern coast of Tunisia. It possessed an airfield which we badly needed in order to supply additional air support for the Sicilian attacks. This island was popularly known as the Gibraltar of the central Mediterranean. We believed that if the island were subjected to an intensive air bombardment, the assault would be relatively easy. In a period of 6 days and nights, approximately 5,000 tons of high explosives were dropped on the eastern portion of the island. Experienced commanders and staff officers strongly advised against attempting this operation, since any failure would have a disheartening effect on the troops to be committed against the Sicilian shore. In the actual outcome, the capture of Pantelleria was so easy that few people had any inkling of the doubts and fears that had to be overcome in launching the operation.
Come on there. Check it out.
The invasion of Pantelleria proved an interesting and valuable experiment. The reduction of the island and the surrender of its garrison of 11,000 Italian soldiers marked the first time in any war that an enemy position had been overcome virtually by air bombardment alone. The underground hangars built by Mussolini's order were of little avail in the island's defense. With its airfield in our possession, we could step up air attacks on Sicily.
We further improved our air position by building a new field on the island of Gozzo, just off Malta.
The terrain at Gozzo was so difficult that there was, at first, little hope of producing a field there. This view proved unduly pessimistic.
13 days from the time the first American construction unit stepped on the island, the first fighter plane was taking off from the strip. This gave us an additional base from which to sustain our attack against Sicily.
At Malta, the Allies made final plans to invade Sicily with the American 7th and the British 8th Armies in early July.
I went to Malta a day or so before the attack was scheduled to be in position to take any action that might prove necessary.
The first major assault on the enemy on European soil was launched chiefly from North African ports. It was a vast, complex operation with 2,500 ships needed to transport the first wave of the invasion forces. Among the troops which were to lead the assault were battle-tested veterans, American GIs who had landed at Casablanca and fought their way across Africa, and British Tommies who had faced the German Africa Corps in the African Desert Campaign.
The ship convoys bringing the troops to their allotted places had to come from ports stretched throughout the length of the Mediterranean. The timing and final maneuvering of the various naval columns had to be exactly performed in the mine-filled waters.
The men were given their final briefing.
Everything was proceeding with seeming perfection.
Allied warships bombarded the invasion beaches for a number of hours.
We were using airborne troops in the operation on a much larger scale than had yet been attempted in warfare. The first troops scheduled to reach the island were these airborne contingents. In the wind and storm, it was difficult for them to keep direction.
Everybody okay?
As the paratroopers jumped high above the shores of Sicily, the high wind dispersed them and altered the course of their descent.
The parachutists landed on the southern front, although in certain instances, far from their appointed landing grounds. The weather, which in that part of the Mediterranean is normally serene in summer, began to deteriorate so badly as to threaten our ability to land. Since the wind direction was generally from the west, it was the southern beaches for which we were anxious. The eastern beaches would have the shelter of the island itself. Naval personnel has a habit of referring to wind velocity in terms of force. For me, this had to be translated into miles per hour. But I had no difficulty in realizing that force 5 was worse than force 4. The day wore on and the wind velocity increased alarmingly. There was nothing we could do but pray, desperately. We had thought it possible that the admiral in charge of the assault convoy might even postpone the transfer to small boats for several hours, hoping for better weather conditions. It was difficult to believe that landings in that area were feasible. Landings in the 45th Division sector constituted a fine exhibition of seamanship. On both flanks, the landings from the sea seemed to be proceeding well, with only moderate opposition. Up to that moment, no amphibious attack in history had approached this one in size. Along miles of coastland, there were hundreds of vessels and small boats afloat, and ant-like files of advancing troops ashore.
It was July 10th, 1943, and Allied troops were on European soil at last. The battle to the death with the Nazi war machine was about to be joined.
As battle reports began to arrive, it was evident that the enemy had been badly deceived as to the point of our attack.
During the first 2 days, against little opposition, the Allies landed 80,000 men and put ashore 300 tanks and large quantities of other mobile pieces of equipment. Our foothold was established. In command of the U.S. 7th Army was General George S. Patton, Jr., who was given the assignment following his success in North Africa.
The enemy's best formations were located largely on the western end of the island, which he had apparently believed we would select for attack. His reaction was typical. He pushed east and south to attack the American 1st Division at Gela.
The Allies dug in and waited. German counterattack seriously threatened the Allied foothold, and Allied warships quickly went into action. For many hours, we met the enemy head-on in a bitter battle. The enemy was stopped dead. Allied troops seized the offensive and drove the Nazis back. This was but the first of many withdrawals the Nazis would be forced to make all over Europe. The vaunted Nazi Wehrmacht did not look so mighty in defeat. The Nazis' only chance to slash the Allies to pieces had been unsuccessful, and a complete Allied conquest of the island was inevitable. Equally important, the enemy's air power on Sicily was thoroughly destroyed by the Allies. Our troops moved forward in a drive to complete the conquest of the island as quickly as possible.
General Patton was a shrewd student of warfare who always clearly appreciated the value of speed in the conduct of operations. Veteran troops realized that by continuing the advance and attack against a shaken enemy, the greatest possible gains are made at minimum cost. The point the Allies wanted to capture at the earliest possible moment was Messina, the enemy port directly across the narrow strait from the Italian mainland. Mount Etna dominates the whole northeast corner of the island, and the Eighth Army's route to the northward lay over a narrow road along the seaward shoulder of the mountain. General Patton, in the meantime, pushed forward to the center of the island, entering Palermo within 12 days after the initial landing. Patton's rapidity of movement broke the morale of the huge Italian garrison.
On July 22nd, Palermo was captured with little opposition. Rolling through the city on its way east toward Mount Etna, where the Nazis were making a last desperate stand, the American Seventh Army was greeted by the complacent Sicilian townsfolk. General Eisenhower visited the conquered city on August 1st on a tour of inspection of the area now controlled by the Allies.
The higher commander must constantly plan as each operation progresses, so to direct his formations that success finds his troops in proper position and condition to undertake successive steps without pause. Patton employed these tactics relentlessly and thus minimized casualties.
Before completing the conquest of Sicily, Allied troops still faced some bitter fighting and some extremely rugged terrain.
In the advance eastward from Palermo, the left flank of the Seventh Army, following the coastline, advanced along the rocky coastal cliffs of Sicily. The only road was of the shelf variety, a mere niche in the cliffs interrupted by numerous bridges and culverts that the enemy invariably destroyed as he drew back fighting. The advance along the coastline toward Messina by the Seventh Army was a triumph of engineering and gallant infantry action.
Meanwhile, the British were assaulting the enemy on the island's eastern coast.
The British Eighth Army's attack initially proceeded swiftly and quickly overran the eastern beaches, to include the Nazi port of Syracuse, most important to our supply plant. Montgomery's operations on the east coast had begun auspiciously. But by the time he was ready to assault the natural defensive barriers running from Mount Etna to the sea, the enemy had brought up too much strength. Thereafter, the northward path of the Eighth Army was fully as difficult from the terrain viewpoint as was the eastward advance on the left of the Seventh Army. In addition, the Eighth Army had to overcome the preponderance of enemy strength. As the 7th Army approached the western slopes of the Mount Etna highlands, fighting became more and more severe.
In its path lay the peaceful little town of Troina. Troina is roughly 20 miles west of Mount Etna. The 7th Army's immediate objective lay in a narrow valley surrounded by imposing ridges. The countryside was rocky and covered with brambles, and from positions on the ridges, the defenders were ideally situated, for their guns could command every square yard of territory beneath. Mechanized units of the 7th Army moved forward to advantageous positions in preparation for the start of the battle at Troina. As stealthily as possible, the stage was set for the attack. To the foot soldier, the terrain was about the worst encountered so far. The roads twisted through the valley, and everywhere the German guns covered them from the slopes. The job was to blast those slopes, and then to capture them one by one. The Allies were ready.
The Battle of Troina, conducted largely by the 1st Division, was one of the most fiercely fought smaller actions of the war. The enemy launched 24 separate counterattacks during the battle. The ground was rocky and broken, with hidden areas difficult to clean out. After the capture of the position, our troops were astonished to find in one small valley a field of several hundred German dead, so far uncounted. They were victims of American artillery fire.
After a week of the most savage fighting, the hungry, battle-weary American troops entered what was left of the town of Troina. They found the inhabitants, who had survived 2 days of incessant bombing and shelling, still dazed by the nightmare that was the Battle of Troina. Most of the Sicilian people were overjoyed when, on July 25th, the bombastic Duce was summarily deposed as Premier of Italy by the order of King Victor Emmanuel. The battle for Sicily ended abruptly at Messina on August 17th, with the final surrender of 135,000 Axis soldiers.
The results of the Sicilian campaign were more far-reaching than the mere capture of the enemy garrison. The Italians wanted frantically to surrender. However, they wanted the assurance that such a powerful Allied force would land on the mainland simultaneously with their surrender, that the government itself and their cities would enjoy complete protection.
Leading the assault in the south, General Sir Bernard Montgomery was scheduled to slip across the strait with 2 British divisions and make the invasion of continental Europe an accomplished fact. The assault was to be launched from Messina, last enemy stronghold to fall in Sicily. During the first days of September, British Tommies went aboard ship in preparation for the landing only 6 miles away across the strait. The invading forces were 2 crack units, the 5th and Canadian Divisions of the British 8th Army. The moment when we would come to grips with the enemy on his home continent was at hand. In the hours just before dawn on September 3rd, the 4th anniversary of Britain's declaration of war, the assault wave set out. Just across the Strait of Messina on the Italian coast, the spearheads of the attacking force landed near Reggio Calabria against almost no resistance, and a 10-mile beachhead was quickly established. With their foothold on European soil made secure, Montgomery's men were now started on their job of forcing the enemy back without let-up. The entire stretch of Italian coast, bordering the Strait of Messina, on both sides of the landing beaches, was soon completely under Allied control. Montgomery immediately started an advance up the toe of the boot. His troops were carefully watched by the enemy, anxious to detect our major move. At Algiers in late May of 1943, the Allied High Command had weighed every consideration involved in the overall strategy of the invasion of Italy. A major factor was the possibility of an Italian surrender to coincide with our landings.
The Italians wanted frantically to surrender. However, they wanted the assurance that such a powerful Allied force would land on the mainland, that the government itself and their cities would enjoy complete protection.
Simultaneously with the hoped-for Italian surrender, the plan called for the Italian mainland to be invaded by Allied forces at two additional points. On the west coast at Salerno, British and American troops were to make the assault. At the same time, a smaller force of British troops was to land at Taranto in the arch of the boot. The negotiations for the Italian surrender dragged along, but finally word crossed the world that Italy had capitulated.
It was agreed that the surrender should become effective on the evening of September 8th. I chose that date because at midnight, our Salerno attack would begin.
In the Mediterranean in September 1943, the Italian fleet, still a powerful striking force consisting of more than 100 warships, was surrendered to the Allies. General Eisenhower himself reviewed the array of surrendered Italian war vessels, no longer a menace to our movement in the Mediterranean. As the day for the invasion of Salerno approached, convoys were crossing the Mediterranean from several directions. American troops had embarked on their transports at Oran in North Africa and Palermo in Sicily. British troops had boarded ship in Bizerte in Tripoli in North Africa. The American Fifth Army, which was to make the Salerno assault, was commanded by Lieutenant General Mark Clark, General Eisenhower's former deputy, who was getting his first taste of action in World War II. En route to the point of attack, the invasion forces were given their final briefing. The last-minute preparations for battle followed a now familiar pattern. For hours on end, the men cleaned and checked their weapons, and then enjoyed their last chance to relax for some time to come.
All hands, man your battle stations! Man your battle stations!
With the landing still 12 hours away, some of the ships and the convoys were attacked by enemy planes, intent on beating off the invasion by sinking some of our vessels and their invaluable cargo of assault troops. But our Navy gun crews were equal to the challenge. By this time, with each hour drawing closer, our intentions were becoming clear to the enemy.
With the equivalent of 4 divisions in the assault, we were invading a country in which there were estimated to be 18 German divisions. Although follow-up troops would double the initial assault strength, in some respects, the operation looked foolhardy.
The Allied troops landed at dawn on September 9th along a 25-mile stretch south of Salerno. The Italian surrender had little effect on the Nazis' stubborn resistance. For 2 weeks, the Germans had prepared defensive positions covering the beachhead, and the invading British and American troops had a tough time establishing a foothold.
The landing and succeeding operations developed almost identically to our intelligence predictions. It was a sharp but relatively short fight in getting ashore, and with minor exceptions, the details of the actual landing proceeded well.
By afternoon of the invasion day, the enemy's chance of annihilating our position was lessened considerably. But the enemy was not giving up that early. With every weapon at their disposal, the Germans, under the command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, kept pounding at the Allies' limited beachhead. Nazi reinforcements were brought up, and from the high ground inland, the Nazis still kept the beaches under constant fire.
On September 13th, the German attack struck in all its fury, and fierce fighting ensued for a considerable period. The German attack pushed forward to within 2 or 3 miles of the beach. The outlook became gloomy.
The battle for Salerno was bitterly contested. On our success in beating off the German counterattacks depended the whole future pattern of the war against Hitler. The Allies finally had a more secure beachhead after 7 days of intense fighting, but they paid a high price. Losses were heavy, hundreds of Allied dead and wounded, among the first of millions of casualties to be suffered by the Western Allies in capturing the Nazi fortress of Europe. The enemy still had to be driven back from the area surrounding the landing beaches. Allied warships played a major part in effecting the Nazi withdrawal. Allied bombers from North African bases continued the bombardment of the enemy's positions.
What's Bombay doing?
In one 24-hour period, 1,400 tons of bombs were dropped on the stubbornly resisting Nazis. The Allied forces were now in position for a general advance, which soon turned into a full-scale offensive. With the Fifth Army advancing steadily in all sectors of the front, the enemy was forced to fall back. The Nazi withdrawal, accompanied by only sporadic delaying action, enabled the Allies to consolidate their gains in the area surrounding Salerno. The long, arduous battle for Italy was now underway, a campaign which was to become known as one of the most exhausting major operations of the war. The Italian campaign was already proving extremely difficult on the tactical level. The natural terrain advantages which the Nazis enjoyed in their defensive role combined with the weather to make the job ahead an especially tough one for Allied commanders. Meanwhile, in the south, Montgomery was taking advantage of the Nazis' preoccupation with the Salerno assault to proceed quickly up the toe and shin of the boot. On September 16th, advance elements of the British 8th Army met some of General Clark's 5th Army troops south of Salerno, and the Allies had an effective hold on southern Italy. In his commander of the U.S. 5th Army, General Eisenhower had complete confidence.
Clark was a relatively young man, but an extremely able professional, with a faculty for picking fine assistants and for developing a high morale within his staff. I gained a lasting respect for his planning, training, and organizing ability, which I have not seen excelled in any other officer. When General Clark led the Fifth Army into Salerno, he had not previously participated in any of the fighting of World War II. He proved to be a fine battle leader and fully justified the personal confidence that had impelled me to assign him to such an important position.
One of the most important prizes in our path in southern Italy was the enemy air base at Foggia. Encountering limited resistance, British troops captured that prize in late September. It placed important objectives from Germany to the Black Sea within range of our bombers, and denied the enemy an important base from which to attack our advancing troops. To the north of Salerno, in the U.S. Fifth Army's path, lay Naples, which our forces entered triumphantly on October 1st, 1943. Naples had been one of the Nazis' principal port cities and marked a notable advance for the Allies on the road to Rome. When American troops entered the city, they found the remains of a legendary center of cultural life. In taking Naples, the Allies had been forced to bomb and shell the city severely. Whatever survived that assault had also to withstand the demolition set by the retreating Germans. Much of the damage to Naples was the work of the Germans. The city was subjected to as savage demolition and bombing as any other population center so far captured in Italy. Within the ruined city, the business of daily life was paralyzed. The Germans had been so thorough in sacking Naples that it was like a phantom city, dazed and silent. In the devastated city were nearly 1 million people who must be provided with at least the bare necessities of life. Most of the surviving Neapolitans were suffering acutely from thirst after the destruction by the fleeing Nazis of the city's water supply system. The urgent craving for water and food became the chief obsession of the people. The final German job of scuttling was a delayed operation. 13 days after they had evacuated the city, the post office blew up, following the explosion of a German time bomb. There were scores of casualties. The port facilities of Naples were a complete wreck. Ships had been sunk by the Germans to block the piers, so that when the Allies entered, there was not one full berth available. Other ships had been sunk to block channels. Retaining walls for some piers had been blown up. The port was completely unusable. But the port did not remain in that condition for long.
The combination of engineers and sea salvage experts who had constantly amazed us with their exploits in the rehabilitation of harbors immediately went to work. All of their prior successes at Casablanca, Algiers, Oran, Bizerta, and Palermo were as nothing compared to the speed and efficiency with which they repaired the seemingly destroyed and useless harbor facilities at Naples.
On October 10, 1943, only 10 days after the Allied liberation of Naples, the port was handling a tonnage equivalent to the peacetime capacity of 6,000 tons. On a single day, Naples port workers sometimes unloaded as much as 5 times the peacetime high. With the port repaired and once again in operation, desperately needed equipment and supplies were brought in to bring some relief to the stricken city. Through the Allied military government, the food so vitally needed to prevent wholesale starvation was quickly made available to the Italian people. For many inhabitants, the Allied liberation came just in time. After months of malnutrition, Neapolitans could look forward to eating regularly again. Slowly, Naples was rising again from its ruins. Under the guidance of American military officials, Italian workmen set eagerly about the task of rebuilding their historic city. During the first month after the liberation, electric power was restored. With its public utilities functioning, life began again for the 800,000 Neapolitans who had lived through the ordeal of Nazi occupation.
While the summer and fall fighting was in full swing, we received word that President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill and their staffs were preparing to hold another joint meeting, this time near Cairo. It appeared to me and to my associates at the Cairo conference that the British still favored a vigorous and all-out prosecution of the Mediterranean campaign, even, if necessary, at the expense of additional delay in launching the cross-channel invasion, while the Americans declined to approve anything that would detract from the strength of the attack to be delivered across the channel early in the following summer.
In Sicily, after the conference, General Eisenhower had the opportunity to renew private talks with the president.
His conversation revolved more around post-war problems than those of immediate operations. He gave me his ideas on the post-hostilities occupation of Germany and listened sympathetically to my contention that occupation should become a responsibility of civil agencies of government as soon as the exigencies of war might permit. He mentioned domestic politics only to say that much as he'd like to go back to private life, it looked as if he'd have to stand again for the presidency.
The swastika of the Nazi Party. It is gone today, blasted from the earth, but the memory of its evil genius remains. Great is man's devastation of his own handiwork. Some men's thirst for conquest is unquenchable. Names like Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun freeze the blood of men and strike terror into their hearts. Such a name was Adolf Hitler.
Und vom Feinde ein Leid erduldet.
What kind of man was this strutting, shouting fanatic of the Third Reich? If anyone really knew Adolf Hitler, surely it was his own family. Here is Adolf Hitler's sister today. Her name is Paula Wolf. Let her speak.
Als mein Bruder Adolf ungefähr 2 Jahre alt war,
I quote her. When we children played together, my brother Adolf was always the leader. All the others did what he told them to do. They must have had an instinct that his will was stronger than theirs. Father wanted Adolf to become a government official as he was himself, but my brother could not make up his mind. He wasn't the type to sit all the time, and therefore, as a government official, he would not feel at home.
Und hinter uns kommt Deutschland!
Hitler, a faceless nobody, a failure in early life who rose from the depths of a defeated and despairing Germany after World War I and fell at Armageddon years later amid the terrible wreckage of his own creation, the Third Reich. To historians, Hitler's success with the German masses stemmed from his gift of oratory, from his speeches, which had something of Wagnerian music, a foggy conglomeration of gods and heroes and blood and race. The tale of his boyhood in Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany is soon told. In the city's streets, among the crowd, the camera's eye seeks in vain for the son of a petty customs official. Proud, apart, almost friendless, he dreams of being a poet, an architect, an artist. But he winds up as a house painter and sometime common laborer. Through his 20s, the world knew nothing of him. "1914. The Great War rescues him from failure, a time for heroic deeds. A new symbol, the swastika, rises from black German defeat. Members sign up for the German Workers' Party. The symbol appeals to Adolf Hitler. As a corporal, he had been wounded and gassed in the war, and he soon leads the bitter veterans in the dark days that follow. The parades are an integral part of this new political force, soon to become the Nationalist Socialist or Nazi Party. It is now 1920, and Hitler talks himself into the leadership of the party. 1923, Hitler and General Ludendorff lead the abortive beer hall riots in Munich. Hitler goes to prison, and the fanatic Dr. Goebbels takes over the party. From headquarters in Munich, Goebbels screams, "We build the Third Reich on propaganda." While the parades go on, Hitler sits in Landsberg prison and writes Mein Kampf, the Bible of the Nazi movement, the answer to unemployment, breadlines, depression. Fight, fight. Julius Schaub, an early follower of Hitler and a fellow prisoner during Germany's days of desperation, talks now.
Während unserer gemeinsamen Festungszeit im Land.
I quote, "While we were prisoners together at Landsberg, Adolf Hitler spent the mornings working on his book, Mein Kampf. In the evening after supper, when we came together, he used to read us several chapters from his book. There were discussions. The main participants in these discussions were Hess, Griebel, and Dr. Weber. For us young people, it was a training school, if I may say so, because at that time we hadn't realized just what Adolf Hitler was planning to do." Out of prison and now a hero, a happy Hitler resumes control of the party. The fascist salute, borrowed from Mussolini, becomes part of the ritual, along with the banners and the rallies. Other close ties with the Italian fascists are built. Hitler and Rudolf Hess greet Mussolini in Munich, perhaps seeking to learn the way to seize power. The anti-Semite fanatic Julius Streicher is there, and the groundwork is laid for cooperation between the fascists and the Nazis before Mussolini returned to Rome. Behind the pattern of demonstrations, parades, inflammatory speeches, and rituals lies a diabolical purpose. Hitler says in Mein Kampf, man is a fighting animal. A nation, being a community of fighters, is a fighting unit. Any living organism which ceases to fight is doomed to destruction. The present government is weak. Therefore, true Germans must fight this government, conceived in shame and perpetuated in weakness. In speech after speech, Hitler screams his dogma at the German people. Nazi meetings begin to look more like military maneuvers than political rallies. 1928. Hitler has 12 seats in the German Reichstag. By 1930, the World Depression is strangling Germany. Hitler now has an ally. Rioting and disorders play into the hands of the Nazis. And by 1932, they hold 230 seats. Violence and intimidation become part of the pattern. Their newspapers, filled with inflammatory propaganda, carry the message. 1932, Hindenburg defeats Hitler for the presidency by a slim margin, the beginning of the end for him. January 30th, 1933, Hindenburg is through. Hitler is named Chancellor, and in a torchlight parade, his followers pay pagan homage to the undisputed master of Germany. The Stahlhelm or steel hats, the SS elite guards, and the SA stormtroopers are all there, and they will spread terror throughout the land. Hitler now has the support of the big German cartels. Hitler is now able to put into practice his thesis as spelled out in Mein Kampf, that the aim of all education and all effort is to produce a German who can become a soldier. The Nazi Party can now start organized persecution of those Hitler has declared enemies of the state. Attention, Jews, the sign reads. The Nazi Party's chosen goons will carry out their orders with a will. They swoop down on their victims. Homes are broken into day and night. Hitler says in Mein Kampf, only the application of brute force used continuously and ruthlessly can bring about a decision in favor of the side it supports. Early in 1933, all meetings of the Communist Party are forbidden in Germany. After the Reichstag fire, 4,000 are arrested and hurled into concentration camps behind barbed wire fences. Brown shirts and black shirts join in these roundups. Up to the time of Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, control of the Prussian police has rested in the hands of the President. Now that is ended. The Prussian police are commanded by Hermann Goering, whose beer barrel shape contrasts with the lean, hard bodies of the men under his command. But there's not to reason why or to question the will of the Führer. August 2nd, 1934, President von Hindenburg, the idol of the German people, dies. Hitler digs in, assuming the presidency and consolidating the office with that of Chancellor. He prods the German people toward his goal at an ever-quickening pace. The Nazi Party consolidates its strength and follows its blueprint to dominate the entire country. Hitler begins to acquire the glassy stare of the self-convinced messiah and has already become a total dictator. Several months earlier, he told a dismayed Reichstag the details of his first bloodbath. Minister President Hermann Goering, Hitler says, has been the avenging angel of the Führer. Kurt von Schleicher and his wife have been shot dead. Captain Ernest Röhm, once Hitler's companion, is gone. Cries out Hitler, if anyone reproaches me and asks why I did not resort to the regular courts of justice, then I say this. In this hour, I was responsible for the fate of the German people. A large standing army is forbidden by the Versailles Treaty, but for a long time the Nazis have managed to circumvent this. Since 1925, they have had an organization known as the Reichswehr, under Baldur von Schirach, the youth organizer. There is a cadet corps and a phony labor corps. Every village, every town, every city adds to the roster of young men trained to serve as soldiers of the Reich. These labor battalions are pledged to serve Hitler in these words: never in the trenches, never surrounded by bursting bombs, but we are soldiers of the Reich. At first, these men drill with shovels, and Germany has more hunting clubs than game, a cover for other military organizations. Gradually, the world begins to see through this massive subterfuge.
Kamerad, woher stammst du? Aus Friesenland. Und du, Kamerad? Aus Schlesien. Von der Saar. Ein Volk, ein Führer, ein Reich, Deutschland!
Increasingly bolder with each passing day, the conspirators against world peace soon are strong enough to forget the false labor battalions and the phony shovels. Armed with real guns and striding along in new uniforms, they are a finished fighting force. Cavalry, another violation of the Versailles Treaty, whose framers remembered the feared Uhlans, passes in review before the Reichsführer. Panzer cars begin to appear. As time passes, the goal, world conquest, seems closer. Hitler begins to feel that he is as ready as he ever will be. March 7th, 1936. He announces his troops will reoccupy the demilitarized Rhineland. The troops march west, 35,000 strong. Don't worry, Hitler tells the Allies, this is only symbolic. Nevertheless, world capitals are jittery. Paris considers mobilization, but nothing happens. Britain is too preoccupied with her economic problems. Hitler's bold revival of German militarism, the reappearance of the German eagle, the dedication of the Nazi Party, all these signs fail to arouse action. America, with prosperity returned, is indifferent. By 1938, Hitler has an air force of 1,500 first-class fighters. tanks and Panzer cars for his slick motorized division, and 3.5 million trained soldiers. March 11th, 1938, the Führer makes his first move across traditional German borders. He invades Austria, and within 2 days, a puppet Austrian chancellor proclaims the unification of the two countries. Another diplomatic card in Hitler's hand, the revived German Navy, a nightmare to Britain with her exposed sea lanes. She, France, and Italy sign the infamous Munich Pact. September 1938. By the following March, Hitler gobbles up the remainder of a prostrate Czechoslovakia. The great Skoda munitions works is added to the Nazi arsenal. More weapons for the Führer's conquests. The Munich Pact becomes a symbol of appeasement, and the world wonders where the next strike will be. And now Russia begins to show an active concern. No bridegroom could be happier than Adolf Hitler, who is keeping his rendezvous with destiny. In 6 short years since he became chancellor, the German eagle again has the world trembling. Facing France, the Siegfried defense line bristles with tank traps and guns. But Hitler's move will not be there, but to the east. Yes, Poland is the next target. As Germany and Italy sign a military pact, the German divisions are sent to the Polish border and begin maneuvers. The world, hoping for Russian intervention, is shocked when Hitler and Stalin sign a friendship pact. It is not long before the maneuvers are recognized by the world for what they are, preparation for another Hitler invasion. To the Polish border, Hitler has sent divisions of cavalry to cope with the Polish mud when it becomes too difficult for the mechanized divisions. Everything goes according to plan. Out of the youth groups have come divisions of hardened soldiers ready to die for the fatherland. Out of the young groups of athletes who practice jumping come the tough paratroopers ready to strike with lightning speed. From the glider clubs, supposedly sports clubs, come the trained pilots to man the Messerschmitts. And out of the merchant marine come the trained submarine crews, ready to man the Atlantic wolf packs with which the world is ill prepared to deal. Yes, the youth groups are serving their purpose in the Nazi master plan. September 1st, 1939. Germany's radio stations crackle out the warnings, stand by, something big. Inside one heavily guarded studio, the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, speaks. The news is world-shaking. Germany has invaded Poland. Within 2 days, France and Britain have in turn declared war upon Germany. From the balcony of the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler speaks to the people. Let us do duty. He is shocked and furious at the allies who come to the aid of Poland. There is fighting in the streets of Danzig, desperate fighting all over Poland. Poland is literally burned off the maps of the world as the Panzer divisions execute the first of the ferocious blitzkriegs. The German-Polish frontier disappears as the Poles try to oppose a moving 20-mile wall of steel and firepower with their ancient cavalry. Hitler goes to the front to view the slaughter at Poznan. In 3 weeks, the nation is reduced to unresisting ashes. Britain and France had decided to come to the aid of the stricken country, but there is little they can do. Before the autumn leaves have fallen, the subjugation of Poland is complete. The world now knows it is engaged in a death struggle with the former unemployed house painter now become world conqueror. The screeching fanatic is familiar. But what about the man? In Bavaria, at Berchtesgaden, the man Hitler has built himself a hideout. It has a patio overlooking the wild mountain known as Untersberg. It is here that he entertains top Nazi officials in private. And it is here that his love for a woman grows and becomes a strange part of this implacable despot's private life. Eva Braun, ex-receptionist in the photo shop run by Hitler's photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, had begun to appear earlier at Hitler's private receptions at his mountain retreat. Few people knew the strange fascination he has for women. Because of him, 3 had tried suicide. Eva Braun walked into Hitler's life in the early 30s, but only his intimate friends know of the relationship. While he conferred with party aides, Eva was always in the background at Hitler's retreat, the Berghof. As a very young girl, she had been in a woman's institute in Braunau. Hitler took her under his protection in 1932, after she'd tried to kill herself. With Eva came her sister Gretel. In this beautiful setting, the Polish massacre and the coming war with the Allies seemed remote indeed. A cocktail party atmosphere prevails a great deal of the time. Minor party officials whose names are lost to history are there chatting with the Führer, as Eva and her sister and friends provide almost comic relief. And looking at her, one might be inclined almost to pity her. Poor girl, scarcely more than a child, and flattered by the attention of a ruler of her country, she can hardly be expected to act differently. She came from the same humble background as Hitler himself, a possible explanation of his preference for her.
The wife of the Führer's adjutant, Frau Schaub, sheds a new light on the love life of Germany's master. There was, after all, Hitler the ladies' man.
Das Gerücht, dass Adolf Hitler Frauen gegenüber.
She says, those rumors that Adolf Hitler was supposed to be abnormal over women are false. As the wife of a man who was his adjutant for 20 years, I had numerous occasions to watch him in private, and also when in the company of ladies. I can assure you that he was definitely a very normal man. He loved women and loved to be in the presence of feminine beauty. I know all about the relationship between him and Eva Braun from 1931 right up to the end. And I also know about many other love affairs. Eva first was seen with Hitler in his house in Munich, and then at the Berchtesgaden hideout when that was built. She is seldom photographed with Hitler. She is rarely alone at the Berghof. In addition to Sister Gretel, she has many of her friends who help to provide light-hearted diversion, as a balance perhaps for the more serious matters under consideration. They are joined by the wives of Hitler's visitors among the party members. Eva herself enjoys the picture-taking sequences. Perhaps it is the camera that causes the playful mood. Perhaps it is an escape from the frightening decisions being made at these meetings. From top to toe, Eva makes an attractive picture of medium height, blue eyes, round face, framed in darkish blonde hair. We have no comment from Hitler about his sweetheart. From others come varying opinions. Says Heinrich Hoffmann, who discovered her. She is an ordinary, pretty little shop girl with all the frivolity and vanity of her kind. To Dr. Goebbels, she is that stupid flapper. Knowing how Hitler despises fatness in any form, Eva spends a few hours a day in exercise. Of course, Hitler, whose waking hours are taken up with 1,000 duties and obligations, is hardly able to pay her the attention a girl of her years would normally expect. While some of the entries in her diary tell of Hitler's anger and of his neglect and her own mortal unhappiness,
She also writes with pride that she is the mistress of Germany's and the world's greatest man. Then she seems not to mind the neglect. In the Berghof, the housekeeper has long been Frau Raubel, who is Hitler's half-sister. It is her job to keep the establishment going so that De Führer may always use it as a spot for quiet business matters away from the Chancellery. But after her daughter has shot herself for love of Hitler, she resents Eva's installation as her daughter's successor. In the end, Frau Raubel quits her post, leaving Eva the chatelaine responsible only to her lord and master in every sense of the word. Over the years, Hitler's bodyguard, the brutal Martin Bormann, turns the Berghof into a second chancellery, which is always awaiting guests. It has seen such notable personalities as Mussolini, Count Giano, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, others too numerous to mention. This is a reception on the lighter side, however. The chief figure in this group is Herr Professor Goebbels, a frequent visitor to the Berghof. Adolf and Eva pose together for home movies. Then Goebbels and Eva's younger sister, Gretel. Gretel is a more fastidious girl than Eva. In time, she will marry Hitler's aide-de-camp, Hermann Fegelein, and suffer tragedy when he is shot by Bormann as a traitor to Hitler. Hitler's most intimate advisors say they don't know at what point the frivolous Eva becomes his mistress. As the wildfire of the war spreads, Hitler more frequently seeks the companionship of Eva. There has been gossip about Hitler and Eva being the parents of a child, but it seems untrue. This baby is probably the daughter of one of her girlfriends. Here is De Führer in a happy mood. It is hard to imagine now that a great war is raging. Hitler's private guard is ready for a visitor. The only intimation of war comes when someone like Count Giano, Mussolini's son-in-law, comes to Berchtesgaden. Hitler wants to know when Benito is going to keep his promise to come into the war. Several months have gone by and Italy is still neutral. But this serious business does not interfere with the round of gay swimming parties featuring Eva Braun and her friends in a kind of water ballet. The fact that Britain and France are going to make a real effort to cut short the mad career of her lover does not curtail the daily diving practice. The picnic lunches featuring Das Gut Lager beer. Another episode starring Eva with a supporting cast of Nazi leaders visiting Berchtesgaden. Perhaps the habit of stripping the possessions from enemies of the Reich has caused them to forget their manners. The girls at the Berghof are always willing to provide amusement. These lakeside frolics are some relief from the other business of the Berghof, the planning of world conquest. Still more water sports. It is the era of the rubber raft in the Bavarian lakes near the Berghof, and fun for the visiting leaders of the self-styled master race. Far different from the rubber rafts which are floating in the vast areas of the Atlantic with their human cargoes consigned to the sea by Hitler's roving deadly submarine wolf packs. A graphic report for De Führer, enemy dead, and the plans for further conquest. It is now spring again, April 9th in 1940, and the Nazi planes are in another sky. After a brief show of air might and the march of a few divisions, Denmark and Norway fall before the German army. These tiny countries cannot resist the concentrated might of German arms and take their orders for surrender over the German-controlled radio stations. But even Hitler's attempts to remake the map of Europe brings few changes to Berchtesgaden. At Hitler's hideaway, it seems that everything is always the same. The same girls in bathing suits seated on the same blankets, the same water sports, the same carefree air. But not entirely. The beauty of a butterfly's wings are indeed fascinating, as are many things bright and gay. But a butterfly's wings are quite different from those of transport planes. And the transport planes carry a deadly cargo. With blinding swiftness, the chain lightning of the Panzer strikes into Holland. Surrender is almost immediate, then into Belgium. The British are rolled up at Dunkirk. This time, Paris in the spring is a sad Paris. For the second time in a century, German troops march through the Arc de Triomphe. June 22nd, 1940, in the same railway car in the forest of Compiègne, which witnessed the German humiliation of 1918, the French are forced to sign the unhappy armistice. Among the Germans, there are congratulations all around, and De Führer, really letting himself go for once, almost dances a little jig. After a visit to the Paris Opera House, Hitler goes back to Berchtesgaden. He is spending more and more time in the old familiar haunts now, strolling the paths from the Berghof to the tea house that has been built for him. And Eva is less alone than she has been in earlier years. Under the impact of the tremendous events that rock the world, Eva is undergoing a change. She senses the role she plays in her lover's drama, and this time, with Julius Streicher as guest, she acts with more dignity. If Adolf seems detached and moody at times, and even busier than usual with Joachim von Ribbentrop and Mussolini, it is because there are great things in the air. Everything is pointing to a blow at England. The bases in France and Norway, the air battle over Britain. But Hitler has other plans, known only to his intimate advisors, such as Joseph Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler. June 22nd, 1941. Three great Nazi army groups crash into Russia on a vast front from the Gulf of Finland in the north to the Black Sea on the south. The world is shocked. No one has expected this. Hitler and Stalin have been allies. They have split up Poland. They have signed a mutual assistance pact. The drive carries deep into Russian territory. The advance is speeded because the Luftwaffe has absolute control of the air. In the Kremlin, in a slow, halting, colorless voice, Stalin calls upon his people to scorch the earth. But the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, has brought new allies and generals to the Supreme Command. Eisenhower and Bradley join Montgomery and Tedder. 1942. American troops invade North Africa. Hitler's Russian invasion has stalled in a great swirling maelstrom of blood and fire, whose vortex is Stalingrad. July 10th, 1943, the Allies invade Sicily. Hitler has Mussolini in for a conference. The Führer does not like the way things are going in the South. There is a saying, dictators ride to and fro on tigers, which they dare not dismount. Hitler gives the Italian dictator a severe dressing down. Benito listens, knowing his armies are collapsing. Eva is still kept in the background at the Berghof, doing her slimming exercises alone as her Führer struggles with the titanic problems of the war. How can he keep his factories supplying the troops despite mass Allied air raids? How to get more work out of slave laborers whose will to work must be created through terror and torture, and whose physical energy is being sapped by the lack of food due to the strain on the German economy. Full production can hardly be expected from starving men who must push and shove each other for the scraps left for them. Their desperate existence is hardly considered by the residents of the Führer's private retreat atop the mountain in Bavaria, Eva and her friends. During the summer of 1943, the Rhine maidens of the Berghof seem little concerned that their world is soon to crumble in the consuming flames of the Allied counterattack. Little Eva and her friends hardly have the capacity for such speculation. Her sister Gretel, heavier now, joins in the enjoyment in one of the crystal streams near the Berghof. The girls like shower baths. The Germans call them Brass baths. This falls makes a natural one, cooling on this hot summer's day. But the showers of the German concentration camps are a different kind of shower. In place of the cooling mountain water, their jets carry deadly cyanide gas, showers of death for the unwanted, race extermination. Even the clothing will be salvaged. In its death throes, the Third Reich will overlook nothing usable. September the 8th, 1943, under cover of darkness, American and British troops strike across the Strait of Messina and invade Italy. General Mark Clark leads the invasion. Scratch one dictator, Mussolini. German paratroopers rescue him from the prison in which he has been held in protective custody. Brought to Hitler, he thanks his savior profusely. He will live to be hung by his heels in the public square at Milan. Day and night, British and American bombers are taking off from bases in Britain and North Africa to bomb Germany. In German cities, the fire apparatus is kept constantly busy by the 1,000 plane raids. It is 1944, and the Allies have almost undisputed control of the air. Planes sweep through the skies and rain down destruction on Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin, the Ploiesti oil fields, railroad yards, and rocket launching pads. Never has war visited such havoc on the works of man. Hitler's visions of world conquest are beginning to fade. A battle at Monte Cassino in Italy. of many nations are in the bitter fight for the monastery. And they take it and go on to Rome. This is truly an allied army. They understand each other, the universal sign language. The ones who can't understand are the bombed-out civilians. They know little about the mad dictator who has caused their plight, especially the children. Along the shell-torn roads they trudge, seeking shelter. Now for one of the last glimpses of the Berghof. It's the birthday of the son of one of Eva's friends, and war or no war, a birthday deserves a celebration. But even on a birthday, problems press heavily on a dictator's mind. The ring is closing, but there must be some move, some master stroke. And then the bombings. Day and night, day and night. This is the repayment with interest for Warsaw and Rotterdam and Coventry. Yes, the little fellow gets a birthday party. What will the next one be like? Will there be a next one? June 6, 1944. The French coast from Cherbourg to Le Havre. This is D-Day. 40 Allied divisions storm ashore. At Berghof, 2 months later, Hitler and Nazi officials hold a meeting. A desperate bomb plot has miscarried. Several die in the blast, but Hitler escapes. The only after effect is a slight limp. This war, says Hitler, is one of those elemental conflicts which usher in a new millennium and which shake the world once in 1,000 years. This is Schaub, who was then personal aide-de-camp.
Stalingrad.
He says Adolf Hitler's state of health got a lot worse because of the setbacks on the front, especially after the Battle of Stalingrad. He couldn't sleep, his nerves got worse, and he was forced to take to medicine. But I must kill all those rumors. His brain was perfectly in order, right up to his death. On the Western Front, General George Patton unleashes his tanks. Hitler has worked his revenge for what he considered the humiliation of Germany. He is paying its price. To a desperate Hitler, his Blondie is of some comfort. Faithful when even the Fuhrer's life is threatened by his former friends. She is trained to kill on command. On the Russian front, things go from bad to worse. German troops are driven from Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Greece. The next Russian move will be into the German heartland. German troops bravely face the massive Russian attacks with the inevitable results when troops are outmanned and outgunned and hungry and cold. You never see a goose step in the snow. Disaster follows disaster. The Allies storm across France and double their aerial assaults on Germany itself. German troops are surrendering now by the thousand. The white flags of surrender are fluttering everywhere. The GIs pull down the swastika and run up the stars and stripes. So be it, Hitler tells himself. If the Third Reich must fall, let it be to the Americans. But even this is not to be. There has been a deal at Yalta. The British and Americans are to draw up along the Elbe and let the Russians take Berlin. Hitler sees the handwriting on the wall. He must go to Berlin to turn the rout into victory or fall in the attempt. And so, he and Eva Braun go there and install themselves in the Chancellery. There he screams for greater sacrifices. Berlin, a city in its death throes. All day and all night the guns thunder. Civilians decide to make a run for better cover. You get so you take chances. April 20th, 1945, and the Russians are mopping up in the Berlin suburbs. Hitler has called in his staff, the final meeting. Should they fly to the south, Hitler elects to stay until the end and goes to a bunker under the Chancellery with Eva. Himmler and Goering desert. The crashing gunfire is the sound of approaching doom. On April 22nd, Hitler is in a state of nervous collapse. He refuses to leave the bunker.
Julius Schaub remembers the scene.
He says, I entered his bedroom in the bunker with him. On the table there was a 7.5 pistol. He went up to it. I got a terrible shock. He cocked the gun. But no, it wasn't the last hour yet. He was only making sure it was loaded. A few days later, the event took place, which I thought was going to happen at that moment. Defenders of Berlin are routed out. Poison capsules are distributed to the inmates of the vault in the Chancellery. On April 29th, Hitler marries Eva Braun. Adolf Hitler's personal pilot, Hans Bauer, tells about Hitler's final orders. He says, approximately 1/2 to 3/4 of an hour before Hitler's death on the 30th of April, he sent for me. When I reported, he took both my hands in his and said to me, Bauer, I want to say goodbye. For a moment, I was speechless, and it took 20 minutes to say goodbye. And the other things, he said, Bauer, I have 2 more orders for you. The first is, I make you personally responsible for burning the corpses of my wife and me. The second is, see to it that Bormann gets through to Dönitz. Dönitz will become my natural successor. I have given Bormann large numbers of orders and documents to take with him to Dönitz. All the time I was struck by Hitler's clear way of speaking. I couldn't believe that this was to be the finish. burning Nazi capital is taken. The last defenders are hauled from their holes. Amid the complete ruin, it is difficult to find out what happened to the fallen Nazi idol, but the full story is pieced together later. In the basement of the Chancellery, Adolf Hitler shoots and kills himself. Eva takes poison and dies. Their bodies are burned by Joseph Goebbels and Hitler bodyguard Martin Bormann and tossed into this ditch in the courtyard outside their death chamber. Here is Erich Kempka, Hitler's personal chauffeur for many years. He soaked the bodies in gasoline. He says, when I saw the chief for the last time, I definitely had the feeling that the end was near. But there was no change in him that you could see, not in his character nor anything else. He said goodbye and dismissed me. Next day, when the chief was dead, I went on to the bunker just as they were carrying out the corpse. Then came Martin Bormann with Eva Braun in his arms. I took her body away from him and carried her along behind Adolf Hitler. We placed these two bodies side by side in the garden. I had placed on me the exceptionally difficult moral duty of pouring petrol on them and setting fire to them. The corpses burned from 1:30 until 7:30 in the evening. Joseph Goebbels shoots his 6 children and has an SS guard shoot his wife and himself. And the Russians hoist the red flag atop the Brandenburger Gate. American occupation troops arrive from the west, hoist the stars and stripes. Allied leaders, including American generals and Russian generals, take over. The Third Reich dies in a last convulsive catastrophe. The guns crackle sporadically. The Russians are shooting all suspicious persons. Berlin, May 4th, 1945. A city of smoldering ruins, which, like Phoenix, must rise from the ashes of itself. Adolf Hitler has left a mark on his country, which will be remembered for 1,000 years. The 1,000 years he said his Third Reich would endure. Hitler's private mountain lair, Berchtesgaden, shares the fate of Berlin. The scene of his trysts with Eva Braun is a shambles. The actors have left the scene forever. The Nazi leaders are dead or in prison, and the female lead, Eva herself, is a rotting corpse, charred beyond recognition. And what shall we say of the principal actor, the part-time common laborer whose dream of leading his people to world conquest ran the gamut of violence, torture, concentration camps, mass death chambers, and ended in utter destruction. In death, as in life, Adolf Hitler remains the sinister symbol of tyranny, the ruthless tyrant whose mad ambition did not stop with the enslavement of his own people, but stopped only after it had unleashed upon the world the most brutal war in recorded history. Quiet has returned to the gay patio at the Berghof. A quiet which, despite the brutal lesson to be learned from the life of Hitler, has not yet returned to the world. The horrible specter of man's inhumanity to man still dwells among us.
General Eisenhower's understanding of what the GI went through was thorough and sound, an understanding confirmed by the GIs themselves.
Yeah? The general really hit it on the nose. They can talk all they want about the more glamorous branches of the service winning the war. The guy who got the dirty end of the deal, in Italy especially, was a plain GI. Right, Louis?
Check.
You know, before we went into Italy, I thought the Nazis were our only enemy, but the weather was just as tough. And after a while, it was the routine and the same old rations and no chance to sleep that started to get me.
I thought I'd never get back to the States. Never have a meal again that didn't come out of a ration can.
It was perfectly good food, of course, but after a while it began to taste pretty terrible, especially during those months of cold, damp weather when a good meal would have done wonders. The weather turned from bad to worse, and from worse to lousy. It depressed everybody, including the general.
American soldiers frequently referred, in terms of sarcastic disgust, to sunny Italy. Heavy rains fell and the streams were habitually torrents. Men and vehicles sank in the mud.
The war itself was pretty rugged. All the guys I know, who were in 3 or 4 campaigns, pick Italy as the toughest one of the bunch. The enemy wasn't kidding. Every mile we advanced in Italy was won after a stiff fight. And we took quite a beating doing it. It began to look as though the Germans didn't particularly want us in Italy. The terrain was terrible. That kind of country was much tougher on the guys who were advancing. That was us. Than on the guys who sat in the mountains and took pot shots at us.
We'd capture one mountain, and there'd be another one right in front of us. I used to dream about Nebraska and that nice flat land.
But the dream never lasted long. They really let us have it. There were times when those rocks came in handy. Somehow you never had the feeling that you were down deep enough. After a while, you got so mad that you were actually glad when the moment came to move up and start pouring it on the enemy. We used everything we had: rifles, BARs, and mortars.
In temporary stalemates, there always exists the problem of maintaining morale among fighting men while they are suffering losses. Among green troops, the problem is much more serious than among veterans. The attitude of the latter was well expressed in a remark made to me one day by a sergeant. General, he said, on the map, this job looked easy, but now the Heinies seem to have something to say about it. But there's nothing wrong with us that a good rousing victory won't cure. There is an old expression, the nakedness of the battlefield. It is descriptive and full of meaning for anyone who has seen a battle. The feeling that pervades the forward areas is loneliness. There is little to be seen. Friend and foe, as well as the engines of war, seem to disappear from sight when troops are deployed for a fight. Loss of control and cohesion are easy because each man feels himself so much alone, and each is prey to the human fear and terror that to move or show himself may result in instant death. Here is where confidence in leaders, a feeling of comradeship and trust in them pays off. The trained American possesses qualities that are almost unique. Because of his initiative and resourcefulness, he becomes, when he has attained a proficiency in all the normal techniques of battle, a most formidable soldier.
routine was the same, over and over. Up out of a hole and move forward fast, so the enemy couldn't draw a bead on you too accurately. Then down into another hole. Sometimes you couldn't get rid of the feeling that this time might be your last. But after the enemy pulled out, there you were, still alive. It was quite a kick, moving up to take over the territory we'd fought for so hard. Each town we moved into seemed a little closer to Berlin and the end of the war. We didn't fight all the time, although it usually seemed that way to us.
The effect of prolonged combat is always bad. If a unit is brought out of line before the processes of physical and mental fatigue have gone too far, it can be ready for re-entry into battle far sooner than one that has been kept in line too long. Moreover, the periodic rests for the frontline soldier have a splendid effect upon morale, and in any kind of warfare, troop morale is always a decisive factor. An immediate visit along the entire battlefront convinced me again of the soundness of our view that winter operations in Italy would be accompanied by the utmost hardship and difficulty. I felt that maintenance of morale would require careful control of operations and the best efforts of all commanders. Certainly, I intended to be close by to help. My visits to the front were, in addition, the occasion for serious discussion of problems involving particularly replacements, ammunition, clothing and equipment for winter weather, and future plans. Nothing can take the place of direct contact between commanders.
We weren't pulled out of the lines very often, but when we were, we made the most of it. It was quite a luxury to be really clean again, and it was relaxing, just shooting the breeze and knowing that a shell wouldn't be landing on top of you any second. After we took Naples, the first beer was issued since the Italian campaign began. It was brewed right in Naples itself by an American officer who remembered the formula from back in the States. To the GIs who were lucky enough to be on the spot when the first issue was distributed, the beer tasted 1,000 times better than it ever did in Chicago or Savannah. But for every lucky soldier who got beer in Italy, there were a lot more who didn't know there was any beer to be had in the whole country. When somebody in the area had a radio, we'd tune in Command Performance, a program from the States that answered GI's requests.
We feel we could win the war single-handed if we could only hear Carol Landis sigh. Okay, fellas, don't forget your promise. Carol Landis will now sigh.
The guys who had looked at tourist folders about sunny Italy back in the States before the war never expected to find themselves up to their ears in snow. It was hard enough moving our heavy weapons around in that terrain, but the snow made fighting a war almost impossible. Farther back, conditions were just as bad. The roads were treacherous. Transportation was slowed down to a walk. The men were pretty well toughened up, but living in the ground in that area for any length of time meant a sure trip to the medics. Besides pneumonia, there were skin diseases to worry about. Frostbite and trench foot were common. The commander started worrying about our combat strength being cut down.
Because of the miserable conditions along the front, we began to suffer a high percentage of non-battle casualties. Trench foot was one of the principal causes. Cure is difficult, sometimes almost impossible.
If it was a bad case, it was pretty painful. And even with regular treatment, it was tough to get rid of. While you had trench foot, you weren't much of an asset to your outfit as a fighting man. A large number of non-battle casualties could tie up a unit just as much as if they'd been shot to ribbons by the Germans. All through the Italian campaign, we hit areas that were heavily mined. To explode them, we used all the latest gadgets. A mine flail attached to a tank was pretty good at routing them out on flat country. That way, there wasn't a chance of anybody getting hurt. But we couldn't use this trick invention everywhere. In most places, the first part of the job, locating the mines, was done by our old reliable mine detectors. The next step was the really ticklish one. Getting the mine out of its hole and making it harmless took a lot of patience and a steady hand. But it saved many GIs' lives. One of the trickiest of the enemy's traps was the German shoe mine. The case was all wood, and the detonator was plastic, so it didn't register on our mine detectors, which reacted only to metal. To feel out the enemy's positions, to learn where he was weak and where strong, we went on a great many patrols. For the soldier who wanted a chance to see the enemy face to face, this was the ideal group for him to be with. Sometimes we had to walk for miles before reaching territory which might still be in the hands of the enemy. You could never be sure, of course, that some innocent-looking field wasn't full of Nazis, all set to take a shot at you. Even though nothing was moving besides the men in the patrol, you could usually sense it when you were in doubtful territory. From then on, all that training you had in basic came in very handy. All those hours spent on creeping and crawling and generally making yourself a poor target were paying off. Any building was always a possible nest of snipers. Usually it was a good idea, if possible, to approach a building from two sides at once. A few grenades sometimes did the trick, but you could never be sure. Each new patch of ground and each new building might present a tougher problem. You could never be too alert. Every now and then, one of the men got it. It might look as though the Nazis had pulled out, but you could never count on it. But the enemy machines we destroyed by shell fire were good signposts along the route of the Nazis' withdrawal. It grew pretty clear that the enemy was gone. Usually you could expect them to leave behind some souvenirs, always with a good, strong charge attached. No matter how fast they pulled out, the Nazis seemed to find time to booby-trap the place from top to bottom. But they weren't fooling us very much anymore. as we moved on up the Italian peninsula. We got a lot of dope on the Nazis from the natives of the towns we moved in on. Most of them were glad to tell us everything they knew about the Germans. Sometimes their tips were pretty valuable. Most of our information on what the enemy was up to, what his plans were, came from the Nazis themselves, the ones we'd captured. The success of our patrols depended not so much on the number of Nazis we killed, but on capturing some alive and bringing them back to our forward command post. We didn't bother to try to get any information out of them ourselves. Our job was simply to get them back without letting them out from under our rifles, without giving them a chance to pull any funny stuff. Back at the CP, they were questioned separately. At first, they said no to everything. But after a while, the intelligence officer got some of them loosened up to the point where they'd talk. Every now and then, we'd get some information that would really help us in planning attacks against exposed points in the German positions. Any significant stuff, we'd relay back to division headquarters, to our rear. Just to be on the safe side, we'd include some of the prisoners' statements which didn't make sense to us, but might to the men at division. They had the overall picture. All this information, true and phony, which we learned from the prisoners, got a high priority at division. In nothing flat, it would get a good going over by intelligence officers and checked with other late dope they had on the enemy. This would all be worked into a revised map of the enemy's strength in our area. It would mean a lot to the brass when they decided where to hit the Nazis next. Then, not much later, we'd be moving up again, ready to plaster the enemy some more and push him back farther and farther, till he finally had enough.
Shortly before Christmas, 1943, General Eisenhower made a tour of the front lines in Italy. Our advance against the enemy was proceeding slowly, and in many places was bogged down owing to the weather. One of the chief reasons for the General's tour of inspection at this particular time was to try to give a lift to the morale of the men at the front. In addition to coping with the bitterly resisting Nazis, the GIs faced the overwhelming problem of functioning in a quagmire of mud. The Italian campaign was ranked with the toughest waged in the war. The terrain was treacherous. The physical problem of moving forces of men and quantities of equipment in the rugged country was an enormous one. Waging a war in such country required inexhaustible energy. In the mountainous areas, where most of the heavy fighting was centered, the GIs had to make their way painstakingly up to the summits, staggering under the weight of shells they would shortly fire at the enemy.
Carefully planned minor offensives comprised the campaign I used during the winter, amidst the inescapably miserable conditions of the Italian mountains. Yankee ingenuity and resourcefulness were tested to the limit. The terrain was cut up by rivers, large and small, which ran athwart the route of advance. Some of these were so winding that they had to be crossed several times.
The Volturno, which the Allies first crossed in October, was such a river, winding back and forth across the path of their advance. Now swollen by the heavy rains, it became a continuing problem to Allied forces. Since the supply route to the front up ahead must be kept open at all costs, it was imperative that a thoroughfare across the rivers be maintained in usable condition. In December 1943, this assignment was an extremely difficult one. The pontoon bridge, capable of being constructed quickly, was used to great advantage many times during the early years of the war. But occasionally, in critical conditions, it proved not durable enough. In Italy, as in all theaters of the war, casualties were not always the result of direct enemy action. To work out final plans for an Allied flanking movement by a new landing to the north, which he had at first opposed, General Eisenhower departed for Tunisia.
The matter for discussion was a proposed amphibious operation against Anzio, to be launched in January.
The invasion was mounted at the port of Naples, which had been virtually demolished by the retreating Nazis only 3 months before. Preloaded supply trucks were used for the first time in the Mediterranean theater. The invasion fleet of small ships was to head north up the coast for 120 miles and put into shore quietly at Anzio. The Allies hoped to capture the small port there before the Nazis had the opportunity to demolish it. Its seizure intact would lighten considerably the problem of supply over beaches exposed to enemy fire. The plan called for a quick strike at the enemy's flank, with fast-moving motorized units playing an essential role. Selected to make the important landing at Anzio was the American 6th Corps, composed of Allied troops who had seen months of action in North Africa, Sicily, and in the Italian campaign to date. Their mission was to seize the port at Anzio, clear out the coastal defense batteries, and proceed inland to engage the enemy, to divert him from his defense of the main front to the south. The invasion fleet put out to sea the day before D-Day, which was set for January 22nd, 1944. Surprise was to be the keynote of the assault. It worked perfectly. Without the customary pre-invasion bombardment, 6th Corps troops swarmed ashore. The enemy was caught completely off guard. So far, the operation was an easy success.
Military strategy may bear some similarity to the chessboard, but it is dangerous to carry the analogy too far. A threatened king in chess must be protected. In war, he may instead choose to fight. The Nazis had not instantly withdrawn from Africa or Sicily merely because of threats to their rear. On the contrary, they had reinforced and fought the battle out to the end. In this case, of course, one of the principal objects was to induce the enemy to reinforce his Italian armies. But it was equally important that this be done in such a way that our own costs be minimized.
But the Nazis did not overlook the Anzio landing force for long. Before the evening of the first day, the Germans reacted swiftly to meet the emergency. New divisions were rushed into Italy from other fronts, and fresh forces were thrown into the battle to stem the advance of the Allied Anzio force. By the morning of the second day, the Germans opened fire in a desperate attempt to wipe out the Allied beachhead. target area for the savage German attack, Anzio was badly battered in a few days' time. The Allies quickly consolidated their position and prepared to defend their limited beachhead area stubbornly against any Nazi counterattack, however strong. Every protective measure possible was taken to help assure our effective defense of that position. The first German assaults had been withstood successfully, but the Allied troops were fully aware that the Nazis were far from finished with them.
In the final outcome, the Anzio operation paid off handsomely, but in its initial stages, it developed exactly as my headquarters thought it would. Before real results were achieved, the Anzio force had to be built up to more than 6 divisions and had to fight under adverse conditions for some 4 months. On the other hand, the move undoubtedly convinced Hitler that we intended to push the Italian campaign as a major operation. This was a great advantage to the Allies elsewhere.
As a further precautionary measure, mines were planted liberally to harass the Nazis in the event that they succeeded in overrunning our lines. It was by now fairly evident that the enemy was massing for an attack in great force. The Allied Anzio force was fortunate in gaining a little time in which to make thorough preparations for meeting the attack. To counter the expected Nazi assault on their beachhead, the Allies prepared for immediate use every type of heavy artillery piece which they had succeeded in bringing ashore before being pinned down by the Nazi shelling. It was probable that the enemy did not know how much firepower we had concentrated in our beachhead area, and Allied commanders ordered that every possible device be used to prevent them from finding out ahead of time. The Allies used the time to good advantage. After 2 weeks of relative quiet, the enemy commenced their major counterattacks. The Nazi heavy assault was directed by Field Marshal Kesselring, who commanded Axis forces in Italy. The Germans were finally ready to launch their drive to force the 6th Corps troops back into the sea. For 4 weeks, the Nazis gave it everything they had. The Allies suffered considerable losses in equipment as well as in men. The destruction of quantities of materiel made it that much more difficult for the Allies to defend their hard-won foothold. One of the most effective protective measures was quickly taken. A smoke screen composed of 100 gallons of oil to every 8 gallons of water, compressed into a milky fog, was spread across the Allied beachhead, covering an area of many miles along the coast. But with all our best protective measures, we still suffered heavily under the full weight of the determined Nazi attack. Allied casualties were heavy during the 30-day German assault. Hundreds of GIs killed and thousands wounded. At their underground headquarters, Allied commanders of the 6th Corps rushed plans for an all-out attack upon the reinforced German divisions facing them. The disadvantage of a limited position from which to operate was supplemented by the Allied need for more men and materiel. But the 6th Corps attack could not be held up to wait for any possible attempt to bring reinforcements in by sea. The attack was organized with all possible speed. Every weapon we had was pressed into service as the assault got started.
What do I do with myself?
You called some of your friends.
I did, and he's busy.
What do you mean he's busy?
I am busy. Shook you up for a minute, didn't I?
Yes.
Fire!
We hit them with everything. Railway-mounted naval guns, 90-millimeter anti-aircraft, packed howitzers, 75s from Sherman tanks, self-propelled 105s on tank chassis, 155s, and the 8-inchers. After the softening up, our tanks went into action. The back of the enemy's resistance was broken, and the men with the rifles moved forward to press the attack. The Nazis were pushed back, but our bombers continued to harass their retreat. The battle-weary GIs finally had an opportunity to enjoy a few moments' respite after the exhausting hours of continuous heavy action. Our attack was once again on the move, and from this point on, the Axis in Italy was fighting a delaying war. During the violent battle at Anzio, the Nazis suffered countless casualties, and thousands of crack German troops from such elite units as the Hermann Goering Division were captured by the Allies. But the Allies, too, had paid a tremendous price. During the first 30 days of the operation in and beyond Anzio, the combat casualties of the 6th Corps amounted to 17% of its effective strength. British combat losses were relatively heavier than American in terms of the number of troops engaged. The British units lost 27% of their effective strength during the same period. In 4 months, about 33,000 casualties were evacuated by sea from Anzio, including 24,000 Americans, without the loss of a single patient's life as a result of the process of moving men from shore hospitals to the waiting ships. But there were nearly 5,000 other Allied troops who were not evacuated. Arriving in London in the early weeks of 1944, General Eisenhower conferred with his staff officers on the highly complex preparations for Operation Overlord, the long-awaited invasion across the Channel.
Now began again the task of preparing for an invasion. But by comparison with the similar job of a year and a half earlier, order had replaced disorder, and certainty and confidence had replaced fear and doubt.
From the United States came hundreds of thousands of freshly trained GIs, swelling to gigantic proportions the force which was to participate in the greatest invasion in history. The nucleus for this invasion force was formed by the battle-tested veterans of the campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy during the grim year and a half just past. From puny beginnings, the U.S. Army was now grown into one mighty offensive weapon with one objective: